Chapter 16, The South and the Slavery Controversy, 1793 to 1860. So what you probably notice from this chapter is much like Chapter 15 and much like Chapter 14, they're not your typical, this is the president, this is the war that started during this administration, this is the aftermath, this is the election of, they don't follow the political chronology, really, of the rest of the book. I would call these change over time chapters. Right. Chapter 14 discusses the change over time of transportation in the first wave of the Industrial Revolution. Chapter 15 discusses the Second Great Awakening and the change over time of all these utopian communities, artistic and literary achievements, and the feminist movement also, and the cursed transcendentalism. Chapter 16, which in my opinion is a much more interesting chapter than the previous two, discusses slavery, both the growth of slavery during this time period and what it looks like on the plantation. And a lot of our supplementary readings that we're going to do when we study this chapter are really going to focus in on what was the day-to-day life of a person in bondage. What did a typical day on the plantation actually look like? Because we have such a skewed view of this, and we just study about the runaways and the different rebellions and the abolitionists and then the Civil War. But for millions of African Americans, life was very different than that. It was a day-to-day struggle to survive, and so a lot of our readings are going to be focused in on that. So this unit number 3 of the test you're going to have is going to look kind of different, right? I mean, there's really only that first chapter in the unit, chapter 13, that's the more of the stereotypical chapters that you're used to, because then the other 3, or the next 3 I should say, they're all of these change over time kind of catch-all chapters. So studying for this unit is a little different than the previous 2 units. Alright, so we're going to start off here with just a photo from your book, and it's returning from the cotton fields in South Carolina. And we start here because it's all about cotton. Without cotton, you don't have the plantation system in 1850, 1860 in the South, and you don't have the huge increase in the number of slaves, because cotton becomes this super crop that so many whites profited off of, and so many blacks toiled as a result. So cotton is king. That was a very, very common saying in the South during this time period, and to a certain extent they're extremely accurate. So northern shippers, the merchants, right, the merchants of New England, and really the banks of the North also obtained a large amount of the profits from the cotton trade. Right, so these merchants, they would have their ships and they would go down to southern ports like South Carolina, New Orleans, especially New Orleans, and they would fill their ships filled with bales of cotton, and they would transport them either to New England to be used in the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, and elsewhere, and especially overseas to Great Britain. And Great Britain, which still had the dominant market share of textiles in the world, they were using American cotton, southern cotton. Then these ships would sell this cotton, get money, and purchase manufactured goods. Either manufactured goods from Great Britain, who was still the industrial powerhouse of the world, or in these new factories in and around the New England, New York, Philadelphia area, and then ship these manufactured goods to wherever. So it's not. Think of it almost like triangular trade from several chapters ago. Although there's not the slave trade going on in this triangular trade, and really there's only, I guess, 2 lengths of this. The product of the original triangular trade, that of obtaining Africans, is still very, very important in this, because who's growing the cotton, harvesting the cotton, ginning the cotton, but their descendants, right? African American slaves. They have your cotton accounts for half the value of all American exports after 1840. Think about that. Over half of all of the goods that are being sold overseas in America, that the value of that, half of that goes to cotton. That's just a huge percentage. In addition to that next point, the South produces more than half of the entire world supply of cotton. I mean, that is a massive amount. As a result of that, the South gets very cocky, and they think that they can, threaten the North by shutting off the cotton supply. And they felt that if it ever went to a war, a civil war, that Great Britain, who had the strongest navy in the world, would actually back the South, because so much of Great Britain's economic dependency hinged on their textile mills, and the textile mills ran on Southern cotton. And so they were, the South felt that they had really, a trump card that they could play in any type of, you know, antagonistic dealings with the North, because they could just play the cotton. This is just a picture from your book, again, the interior of the Cotton Bureau in New Orleans, where cotton would be bought from riverboats coming down the Mississippi, or overland from areas around in and around New Orleans, and then it would be housed in these big warehouses and sold and resold to middlemen, until they would find a purchaser from an ocean-going vessel to be sold elsewhere. So lots of money. The planter aristocracy. So the South, if you were in this very, very small percentage of people, right, only 1,733 families actually owned more than 100 slaves each, then you had this, gone with the wind type plantation. And as a result of being the absolute top of the southern slave owning population, you had a seat at the table, and it was a pretty small table as far as state leadership, and really to an even greater extent federal leadership. If you think about the presidents up until now, most of them are from the state of Virginia, and that goes also to the members of the Supreme Court and other members of the federal cabinet and different federal positions overseas, even as ambassadors. It was the South, and it was these huge old money giant plantations. Now, that house there is an actual plantation mansion from this time period, and it may look familiar to you because it is an actual house. It was the house used in the movie Django, the Quentin Tarantino movie from 2012, I believe it was. And it's still in existence. It's filmed in a lot of movies. I think the tree-lined entranceway to and from it also appears in Forrest Gump and a couple other movies, but still there today. So that's an example of what one of these plantation mansions would actually look like. Now, how are they becoming so rich, right? They were becoming so rich because there's such massive amount of money to be made. But the chance for big profits also brought about a very, very big risk. And a lot of rich families were just basically run and became destitute because of the inherent flaws in monoculture agriculture. And that's having just one crop, a single crop, and that being cotton. The goal is to make as much money as quickly as possible. And so you're going to plant the same plot of land over and over and over again with cotton. And this is before modern types of fertilizer, so you quickly exhaust the nutrients in the soil. Right? The same areas had suffered the same type of problems with tobacco a couple hundred years prior, and now they're doing the exact same thing with cotton. But Southerners are dumb. This need for ever more land starts to push out the small farmers, and they're forced to basically move west. And what they leave behind are these small farms that are consolidated into ever bigger farms, right? These monster plantations, and they're all growing cotton. There's no other crops that are being grown on any type of commercial scale. Right? We're just talking small scale subsistence gardens, almost, just to feed perhaps your family, if at all, even that. But for the most part, it was cotton, cotton, cotton. The same problem happens here when we're talking about the different financial panics. Well, you can see the weakness that's happening here because there's such money to be made in cotton. There's over speculation in land to grow the cotton and over speculation in the purchase of slaves to grow and harvest the cotton. And I have here on the next bullet point, you can see that it costs by 1860, for a very, very healthy male field hand, so someone who could work out in the fields of young age, approximately your age, 17, 18 years old, that cost $1,800 in 1850-60. That's in the tens of thousands of dollars nowadays. And if you're talking a plantation with over 100 slaves, you can see that we're talking in the millions of dollars nowadays in the amount of expenditure, and that's just to purchase the slave. There's also the overhead. Here, and I have the overhead including food, housing, injuries, runaways, disease, right? Because if your slave dies, then you've lost your entire investment. Also, having an undiversified economy leaves you tied to the mercy of world conditions. And here's what I mean by that. So you're tied to the price of cotton, right? And if you think about nowadays, the price of oil, it's approximately $100 a barrel nowadays. And oil has fluctuated wildly in its cost per barrel over the last 3 decades. And you get countries like Mexico, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and their main export, one of their only sources of income in the global market is the sale of oil. That's called a rentier system. Basically, what you have in the South is a rentier system and the money being made is cotton. As long as the price, the international price of cotton, or in the modern analogy, oil, is high, then the country makes a lot of money, and they can plan, future infrastructure and investments based on that price, right? Because you're always getting loans for stuff, but you can pay it as long as you can keep earning money on the cotton or oil. However, when the price goes down for various reasons, right? Oversupply, where there's just a lack of demand, or where it can get disruptions perhaps in the field. If the price goes down, then the entire country becomes destitute. This happens to Mexico and Nigeria in the 1980s when the price of oil plummets. It just wiped them out, and they had essentially great depressions. So you have these minor recessions that are happening over and over and over again, even in the South during this time period, basically because of oversupply. The textile mills can only crank out so much cloth. There's only so much demand for cloth before it has to build again. But in the meantime, if you have all this cotton that's just sitting in the warehouses, not being used in the textile mills, well, there's really no need to purchase more cotton from the growers. So that's what I was talking about, the risks of an undiversified economy. If you have a diversified economy, you can fall back on another crop: corn, hogs, ranching, wheat, soybeans, right? There's all those commodities, their prices fluctuate. But if your economy isn't tied to just one of those commodities, you can weather the storm if the price goes down for one or two. I also have here a problem of you not having immigration. If you are in Europe and you want to come to America, there's really no incentive whatsoever to go to the South because there's no job, and you can't even get land because it's just being gobbled up by these large plantations. So you're moving to the North, and for the most part, America got the best of the best from Europe. Young people, the risk takers, the intelligent, the Europeans with the great work ethics, and they're the ones that work in the factories and start new businesses and make the North a very rich, diversified economy, whereas nobody's moving to the South. At least willfully. All right, so who's living in the South? Well, only 1/4 of the whites actually own slaves or belong to a slave-owning family. This means that 3/4 of the white people living in the South were not slave owners. Now, the ironic thing, and the somewhat depressing thing, is that in the Civil War, they are the ones that are actually fighting for the Confederacy. Your typical Southern soldier was one of those 3/4. These weren't slave owners that were the common Southern soldiers. The slave owners were the officers, right? They were the Robert E. Lees, the Stonewall Jacksons of the bunch. But you just Johnny Reb, typical Johnny Reb, he was just, a dude hacking a living out in the woods. And what is he doing? He's a subsistence farmer. And they basically raised just enough corn, maybe just enough hogs or goats to feed their family. And they were even treated like crap by this slave-owning oligarchy. They were called such names as poor white trash, rednecks, hillbillies, crackers, and clay eaters. Now, this should be of no surprise, because we still use many of these terms, especially white trash, rednecks, and hillbillies, especially when we're talking about, well, let's face it, people from Indiana. Look around the next time you're in class. A third of the class are these exact people. I mean, this could be one of your typical classmates' houses right here, right? Where, this could be you, right? You're wearing your nice, hillbilly hat there. You got your cut off Daisy Dukes along with your work boots, and there in the back is your sister slash wife. Of course, right? You have your couch outside, which is apparently a prerequisite in Indiana, rain or shine. And here's your daughter slash future wife, right? So I mean, it's a typical life in the day of your Capers, your Chandlers, guys like that. So this is just a table. It shows you here's the oligarchy up here, right? Here's the Rhett Butlers, the Scarlett O'Haras, I forget what Leonardo DiCaprio's character was in Django Unchained, but it was a very, very small percentage. And you can see there's these families. There's the largest. If you're looking at of slave owners, what's the largest plurality group, right? And of slave owners, you have 105,000.6 slave owners, and they owned only 2 to 4. So a large number of slave owning families or properties. You just had these where there was just a couple slaves, and the typical day for a family here is where the whites, the mother, the father, if they have any kids, they're out there, hacking down forests and plowing the fields and getting the horse unstuck out of mud right alongside their slaves. So the life of this is going to be very different than the life of this, both for the whites, right? It's much more prestigious and idyllic, I guess, for them than it is for the small plantation, or not really plantation, the small slave owning class. In addition, the lifestyle for the slaves of these two different plantations is very different also. In many ways, this is a much colder, just machine-like existence, and you're forced to toil, and you're almost just like a number, right? There's no chance of you being really liked or become part of the family. Whereas in often cases, this did happen, where you just become like an extended part of the family, and probably in a lot of cases, you're actually treated pretty well. However, you have no independent culture that you can maintain when it's just perhaps you and one other African American as the slave. Your culture gets dissolved into the white family. Whereas if half of your day, or maybe your entire day, you're just spending with other African Americans, and you're going back to the slave village on the plantation, it's much easier to maintain a separate culture. And this is one of the reasons why African Americans are able to develop a very unique culture in the South that is just created by African Americans, and that they're not just absorbed into the white culture in the South. This is a kind of a cool idea. It shows you how strong, how much Southern cotton production and distribution of slaves grows during this time period. You can see here in 1820, there's really only one major production, that's in South Carolina, and then 40 years, you can see it's wildly explodes here in the Deep South. Now, that was cotton. Here are slaves, right? So you have here percentage of slaves, the total population. You can see here you have large numbers of slaves in Virginia and South Carolina, and then a tiny little bit here along the Mississippi, and that's in 1820. And now you have percentage of slaves in total population, and you can see massive amounts throughout the entire state of South Carolina. Georgia, there's an explosion. Alabama, there's a massive explosion. Mississippi, the African Americans have become the majority in Mississippi, and you can see 40 years earlier, they're not living there at all. Same thing, Louisiana. Even in Texas, you start to see a lot of slavery. So, it should be noted that not every African American was a slave in 1860. There are approximately 250,000. I've seen even upwards of 450 to 500,000 estimates. Nobody really knows. They didn't take very, very accurate figures back then. But there were, in other words, hundreds of thousands of free blacks in the South by 1860. A lot of them are actually living in and around New Orleans. That seemed to be a pretty large free black population there. And they lived a very dangerous, precarious existence. Not only were they prohibited from working a lot of occupations, they had no legal rights whatsoever, so they couldn't testify against whites in court. And you're like, all right, well, oh well. But the reason why that is such a harsh lack of a right is they could be kidnapped, right? They had slavers who were constantly patrolling, especially like the Mississippi and other, avenues of transportation, and they were searching for runaways. But if they were unscrupulous, they could just grab a free black and claim he was a runaway. And that free black then would be unable to testify in court against this. And so, really, they were at the mercy, the whims of slavers. Let's face it, they're probably the most shady people possible at this time period. So, it was a very dangerous existence for them. In addition to that, there were approximately 250,000 free blacks in the North. Now, they weren't slaves, but they were treated like crap. Many times, I've read this not just in the pageant, but in a lot of other books, that, oftentimes their life was even worse in the North, and they were treated even worse in the North, where they were free, than they would have been treated in the South. And so I have here denied the right to vote and from public schools. And when I'm talking about that idea, is even though that the North, was against slavery, that doesn't mean that they like black people. There's massive amounts of racism. And then, on the other hand, even though the South is in favor of slavery, a lot, especially the super rich oligarchy types, a lot of them, when they were babies, they were born thanks to black midwives, and they were raised their entire childhood by black women who cooked for them, cleaned for them, nursed them, treated them, basically raised them like a mother would. And so, and oftentimes they loved, specific black people. It was just kind of a bizarre setup in America, if you think at this time. And that's why I put this quote in here. This quote is directly from your book. And I'll just read it for you. It was sometimes observed that white Southerners, who were often suckled and reared by black nurses, liked the black as an individual, but despised the race. The white Northerner, on the other hand, often professed to like the race, but disliked the individual. And it's just such a bizarre way of looking at it, and yet, I've read in many, many places that this was the truth. So, here are some numbers for you. There are approximately 4 million slaves in the South by 1860. This is despite the fact that there are less than 1 million slaves in 1800. And the importation of slaves is outlawed by 1808. So where are we getting all these slaves from? We're getting them from natural reproduction. Now, I should say, even though the importation was outlawed in 1808, there still was a large amount of smuggling. Smuggling, not specifically from Africa, but you would get a lot of them from the sugarcane islands. So from the Caribbean, they would bring in, illegally, new slaves. But that's a fairly small percentage. The greatest percentage increase, right? The numbers quadruple, is from natural reproduction. And it's because, for the most part, you weren't being worked to death. You weren't being murdered. you were living a life that, let's face it, in many cases was much healthier from a physical standpoint. Definitely not a mental or emotional standpoint, but from a physical standpoint, it was healthier than a lot of places around the world. And one of the main arguments we're going to talk about later is it's probably even healthier than your typical factory worker in the North. Now, one of the dark sides of this was because it was so difficult to obtain a new slave because the importation was illegal. There were instances of breeding programs, and oftentimes women were purchased not because they could pick cotton in the field or sew cloth or work in the house, but because she was of childbearing years, and she was put to work having babies. That's called rape. Let's be honest. When you're purchased for the specific task of having sex against your will to create new children, that sounds it's unbelievably sadistic and evil, and yet that apparently happened in large numbers. Not only they would force a man, right, to breed with the woman, but a lot of times it would be a member of the master's household, whether it be him, his son, brother, something like that, where they would use women as basically sex slaves. And one of the beneficial outcomes from their standpoint was if a child was born. And how sick is that? I mean, that's Thomas Jefferson type of sickness, where you're going to rape the slave, have your own child with her. Let's be honest. Half of that child is your DNA, and then you're going to sell your child to make a profit off of that. That's a certain level of evil that is it's disturbing to even think about. Now, here's what I'm talking about, where the life physically is better, and that's because there's all of these stories about these just horrible tortures and stuff that happen to slaves. But for the most part, they're not being worked to death or killed because you're going to lose your money. I mean, think of it from an economic standpoint. There's over a $2 billion investment in the South in slaves. Northerners, they invest their money in real estate and the stock market, right, in factories. Southerners are investing their money in buying new slaves. So if you're going to buy a slave, the last thing you want to do is kill that slave, especially if they cost $1,800, and that's $1,800 in 1850s. Nowadays, that's tens of thousands of dollars. You're not just going to piss away tens of thousands of dollars. That's stupid. So when your book kind of talks about this, if there was anything dangerous to do on a plantation, they didn't let the slaves do it because they're worried that they're going to get injured or killed. You let the Irish do it, right? The Irish have been coming over in millions, and you get yourself an Irishman to drain a swamp or fix something dangerous, and if he dies, oh well. In fact, if he dies, you don't even have to pay him. So that was one of the unique aspects of the Southern system also. So this is a photo from your book, and I mean that is about as disturbing as it gets. Yeah, I don't even know what to say about that one. Here's also another photo on the left here. This is from your book, and it's a woman, and she's apparently at the slave auction, and they've even put like a tag on her, like almost like if you went to a car lot, and you know how they have those stickers on the windows, giving the information on the car. That's apparently what this tag is. I mean, you can't get much more dehumanizing than this. And this is a photo that I found on the internet, so I can't attest to its veracity, its truthfulness. But this is apparently an actual photo from a slave ship. So I doubt this would be an American slave ship because photography was invented after it was barred, the importation was barred, but maybe a slave ship to Brazil, which didn't ban slavery until the 1880s. Okay, so I've already alluded to this a lot. We're at this point in the chapter, so life under the lash, it varied. What the life was like for a slave, and this is something we're going to really talk about in greater discussions this week under the supplemental readings. But, it depends. It depends on the region. So if you're in the Old South meaning like Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, those areas, Kentucky, life was going to be probably in general easier. Time period. Early on in this time period, so the early 1800s, the late 1700s, life in general as a slave is going to be better. Your master, right? In a lot of cases, you're going to have a horrific, demonic-like master, but that's not always going to be the case. A lot of whites who own slaves, you think like George Washington and even to a certain extent, I guess Thomas Jefferson, where they knew that slavery was shady, evil, and by all accounts, aside from the rape of Sally Hemings, these guys and probably a lot of other masters treated their slaves with a certain level of decency. Although it's tough to say that in the same sentence. However, if you're in the deep South, especially in the 1850s, life sucked for a slave really bad, and you may not even know who your master is. Or I guess you probably would know who he is, but you wouldn't know him on a basis where you would see him day to day, because you would be because these plantations have hundreds of slaves on them. You're just being abused by overseers, right? The slave, the guy that's hired by the plantation owner to basically run chain gangs. And so life there in the Deep South is awful. And it was a constant threat to slaves in the Old South, so in the northern portion of the region, that if they misbehaved, if they ran away, if they pissed off their owner, that he would sell them down south, right down to the plantations down south, where it was generally recognized that life for a slave was much worse. So slaves lived in fear that they would be sold down the river. So where is down the river? It's called the Black Belt. I didn't come up with that term. It's from the book. It's the Deep South. And if you looked at that last map that we showed a few slides ago, it's basically the Gulf Coast states right down there. Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, to a lesser extent Georgia. That area right there, that's where a huge portion, in the later portion of this period, are located. Now, I kind of talked about this before, though. It was generally a tougher existence. However, because the plantations were larger, you had larger communities of slaves. Because they're just with each other all day long, and because there's so many of them, it was much easier for them to develop and maintain a distinctive African American culture. And it's something that you don't see in other slave societies in the United States, and maybe not necessarily even around the world. This is just an advertisement for a slave auction. I've been to Charleston, South Carolina a couple times, and you can see they've maintained one of their old slave auction sites. It's a building in the old section of town, and you can go there. It's a museum. It's pretty disturbing, but they have stuff like this, and you can see the shackles and the holding pens, and it's an actual place where people were bought and sold. This is it's not a torture device, although it was torture. A lot of times slaves would go off into the city and do projects or be hired out to other families or other properties or other businesses, and you didn't want them running away. And so you would fix this collar around their neck, and these things here are bells. And so it's pretty much impossible for a slave to hide if they're running around with this collar with the bells on them. And again, think of how just dehumanizing this is. You're essentially, we do that to cows, right? So they can't do the same thing. So it's awful. This is a picture from your book of a woman apparently doing work. You can see on here she's got this exact collar around her neck. And there's other slaves. Looks like they're cleaning the street or something. So I put these two pictures in here. One's from your book, one I found on the internet. And it goes back, remember a few slides ago I told you that these southern plantation owners, their kids were raised by their slaves. And so here's a portrait on the left here of a slave and one of her master's kids. And so this kid, look, if he's going to grow up and be raised kind of like your mom, you are going to love this lady, right? And you're probably going to treat her very well, because when you get to be an adult, she's going to be middle-aged or older, like in this instance here, right? It's going to be the young white master, and I think in this case he's visiting actually the slave quarters of these two ladies here, and a lot of time the white kids are going to be playing, right? In essence, like going to their grandma's house and hanging out and cooking and listening to stories and music and stuff like that. So these kids, right, are going to love these black individuals, and yet they're going to grow up and inherit the plantation and purchase and sell more slaves. So what a weird, just all right. So the burdens of bondage. I mean, this is the picture when it comes to slavery, and we're going to talk about all the BS arguments that the South makes on why slavery is so good and why they're actually helping out black people. And my only response to them would be this, right? All you have to do is show this picture, and oh yeah, they sure love their slaves. They love them so much. This is what they do to them. But the burdens of bondage. It's kind of weird that they stick this in here, but because most of this subheading of this chapter deals with rebellions, but they also throw in the fact that it was illegal to teach your slave how to read, and as a result, at the outset of the Civil War, 90% of slaves are illiterate. The other 10% either learned to read on their own secretly, or were secretly taught by probably pretty nice white people. So what are black people doing to fight back? Well, most of them are engaging in minor rebellions, right? They're not outright violence, Django style. They're doing what they can to fight the system, but still survive within the system. And here's what I mean by that: slowdowns. They're only working as hard as it takes to not get your ass beat. So if they're told to harvest a whole section in a certain amount of time, they perhaps won't do quite as much, and to hopefully lower the expectations for the next section so that you can work as slow as possible. Theft, stealing food, stealing tools, stealing clothing, basically stealing anything, and you're not going to feel too bad about it because frankly your owner owns you, and so there's a certain probably perverse pleasure you're going to get from stealing something that's property when you yourself are property. Sabotage, destroying crops, destroying tools, destroying buildings, right? Mysterious arsons happen all the time on these plantations. In flight, and what I mean by that is runaways. Oftentimes, slaves would run away, and they're not going to Canada, they're not going to North. They know that they're going to get caught, and a lot of times they don't even get caught, they come back. Where they're running away is they're just running away a few plantations over for a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month, and it's to visit family, right? I mean, that was the goal for a lot of movement among African Americans during the antebellum time period and in the aftermath, which is called Reconstruction after the Civil War. They're looking for lost loved ones. A husband who is sold down the river, a child who is sold to a family, across the county, things like that. A sister, right, who's sold to another family. That's where they're going to visit. They come back, they know they're going to get punished. They know they're going to get whipped, right, and eventually look like this guy. But it's worth it to them to be with a loved one for however brief of a time. And so that's what the vast majority, and you're going to read about this in the supplementary readings, the vast majority of runaways, they're running away to other places in the South, nearby, is usually to visit family members. Now, this is a marked difference from major rebellions. When I'm talking these, the distinction is violence. So the famous Denmark-Vesey case, 1822, happens in Charleston, South Carolina. This is actually caught. They are caught. Several slaves are caught. It's a conspiracy, so they're caught before. I keep saying caught. They are obtained prior to them actually rebelling, and of course they're thrown, on the gallows and killed. The bigger one, the more effective one, I guess you'd say, is the Nat Turner Rebellion. Happens in Virginia in 1831. A bunch of slaves kill a bunch of whites on the plantations. I think they end up killing like 60 whites, something like that. They, of course, are captured and killed. Now, remember in the last lecture when I was tearing into the Transcendentalists in general and Henry David Thoreau in particular, right? One of the leaders of the American Wall of Shame, right up there with Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Gacy, right? And Henry David Thoreau. Well, Thoreau is famous for writing that stupid Civil Disobedience, which hopefully you never have to read. And he gives so much credit for that because, remember, he didn't pay the poll tax. And he's in jail for 1 day. And that's why he's such a martyr. And colleges and your textbook, right, they spend page after page and lecture after lecture just talking about the wonderfulness of this act by Henry David Thoreau. And yet your textbook spends one sentence on Denmark Vesey or Nat Turner. Remember, Henry David Thoreau didn't pay the poll tax because he was against slavery. Somehow he made a connection between that and slavery. Now, did Henry David Thoreau take up arms against the South? Did he try and free any slaves? No, he didn't pay a $1 poll tax. Meanwhile, Denmark Vesey is a free black. He's not a slave. He's a free black. And he is trying to free slaves who are in horrible conditions. Nat Turner, right, is a slave who is trying to free himself and his fellow slaves. I mean, they're actually putting their money where their mouth is. They're actually doing something. And they only get a sentence or two in your textbook. And in college, you're probably never going to hear of these guys. And yet, you're going to be reading plenty of Thoreau. So, enjoy. I also have here on the Amistad. The Amistad's an awesome story. As a lawyer, it's a cool case. I'm not going to bore you with it. There's a great movie made by Steven Spielberg in the 1990s you can watch, but they're not even Americans. It really shouldn't involve America at all. It's these Africans who are abducted in Africa, so they're not even born as slaves. They're taken to Cuba. Then they leave Cuba. They're on a ship a day or two outside of Cuba, and they overthrow the slave ship captain. And they attempt to sail back to Africa, but they end up getting tricked, and they get caught off the shore of Long Island in New York. And there's a big court case of what to do with them. They win, and they get to go back to Africa. So I told you, your book really doesn't want to talk about the Nat Turner Rebellion. Well, tough crap for your book. I'm talking about the Nat Turner Rebellion because I like it. Here's his story. He's born in about 1800. We don't know for sure. He's a slave. He leads the most famous slave revolt in U.S. history. 1831. He and about 80 other fellow slaves kill approximately 60 whites in Virginia, including the plantation owners that owned him. And they killed some women and children. But, hey, collateral damage. Perhaps these women, I'm not going to, well, the children, I guess, is sad. But, the women were part of the slave-owning aristocracy themselves. So, here's the aftermath, though. So the Virginia militia capture and hang 20 of the slaves, including Turner. They also arrest over 100 innocent slaves who had nothing to do with this. They just grabbed 100 black people and they murdered them. Just out of vengeance, just to make a statement to other blacks in the area, don't do what Nat Turner did. Otherwise, not only will you be killed, but probably some of your family and friends will as well. I mean, this is like Nazi type genocide here at this point. Unfortunately, even though I'm a big fan of what Nat Turner attempted to do, it ends up working out to the detriment of his fellow African Americans in this area, because it strengthens the resolve of the Southerners to fight to defend slavery, I should say. So they become very hostile to any and all abolitionists. In addition to that, they pass a bunch of laws, right? A bunch of slave codes, and it says basically that blacks couldn't go anywhere near a gun. They couldn't get alcohol. They couldn't assemble in public. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't own property. They couldn't read and write. They couldn't work in certain professions, and it was all geared towards keeping them in a very, very servile occupation of picking cotton. You can't do anything else, and taking away any type of opportunity or means to either defend yourself or to escape or to rebel. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about abolitionists. There's kind of two categories of abolitionists. The first category you see a lot early on in the time period, and we're going to call these abolitionist lights, right? Not the diehards. They were for the most part in favor of something called resettlement. By 1820, there are over 100 anti-slavery societies, and what they're into is the resettlement of blacks back to Africa. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was one of these back to Africa type guys. There's kind of goes into that whole idea of the North. Remember I told you that they love the race but hate the individual. And here's what I mean by that. They wanted to free African Americans, but they sure as hell didn't want those African Americans competing against them for jobs or living on the same block as them. They wanted them to go away. There's definitely some hardcore inferiority, superiority beliefs here. And so because they believed that blacks were inferior and they didn't want this type of individual to be next to them, they wanted to send them back to Africa. And so the biggest group was the American Colonization Society, founded in 1817. And we actually, America, founded our own country in Africa. So technically you could say we had a colony in Africa in the 1820s. In fact, it's still a country today. It's the country of Liberia. And I don't know, tens of thousands are sent back to Liberia. Now, flash forward, you don't need to know this for AP US history, but the descendants of these former American slaves become the aristocracy in Liberia. And they all have like weird presidential U.S. names. Like they're all named Washington and Monroe and Madison and stuff like that. They don't speak American. They don't speak English anymore. They speak African dialects, and they really abuse the native Africans from this area. And there's a really violent civil war that happens, in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and I think it even leaks a little bit into the 2000s before this aristocracy is finally overthrown, and the native Africans who had always lived there actually take over the government in Liberia. Now, the second wave of abolitionists are much more militant, whereas the first wave, the abolitionist light, they were against the spread of slavery, and they were for the gradual emancipation of slaves. They were for the resettlement of African Americans back to Africa. The radical abolitionists wanted the immediate destruction of slavery yesterday, and they believe in the complete equality of blacks and whites. So this is a very different type of abolitionist. And there's some pretty big figures, and they're tested on a lot, so you have to know who they are. But the biggest white one is William Lloyd Garrison. He starts a newspaper called The Liberator. He travels throughout the North and gives talks, basically, that he demands, and I have written right here, the immediate emancipation of slaves. He also advocated the secession of the North from the South because slavery was so evil. Now, what would this have solved, though? I mean, this is kind of a stupid move on his part. Okay, so the northern states secede from the southern states. Are the southern states going to keep their slaves? Yes. So what has he fixed? Nothing. The other big abolitionist from this time period is an African American by the name of Frederick Douglass. And he's got one of the cooler stories in American history. And unfortunately, your book spends less than a paragraph on him, I believe. So I'm going to fill in the blanks because I like his biography, essentially. He's born in approximately 1817 in slavery. And at the age of 8, he's basically rented out to his master's relatives in Baltimore because they had already kind of spotted at the age of 8 that this kid was bright Like, he's a pretty smart kid, hard worker. So we can make some money just renting him out to relatives. And this is from Frederick Douglass's own biography, where he tells the story. His new master's wife was apparently a good lady, and was against slavery. Now, her husband obviously was in favor of slavery, but we already talked about the life of the female at this time period, so it wasn't her call. So she secretly taught Frederick how to read and write, apparently when the father wasn't around. So Frederick Douglass becomes one of the very, very rare literate slaves. And what he did for money is he worked in the shipyard of Baltimore caulking ships. Right? Ships used to be made out of wood back then, and so the wood has seams, and you have to fill in the seams with various resins and stuff like that so that they don't leak, so they don't sink. It was apparently back then considered to be a highly skilled job, and that's what the young Frederick Douglass did while he was a slave. And the money, so his earnings, the wages he earned caulking ships, would then be given to his master. So when you think of a slave, especially in the northern area, we're not talking about just working in the fields picking cotton, but we're talking about the same type of job, right, as a white would have. And remember in the last lecture when I said that there was such hostility between the Irish and African Americans, it's because they're fighting for these same type of jobs, right? Working on the docks, unloading and loading ships, maybe the more skilled jobs like caulking ships, being a carpenter, a blacksmith, stuff like that. So in 1838, as a man, now he escapes, right? He runs away. He initially escapes to Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, he can't find work, so he tries to go to New York, which has a large shipping industry. He figures he can use his skills as a caulker to get work. But remember what I said is going on in the North, right? African Americans are not treated well at all as individuals in the North, and so whites refuse to work with him. So he can't find job as a caulker in New York, despite the fact that there should be work for him there. So he ends up being a garbage man and a ditch digger. And he starts attending anti-slavery meetings. One of the meetings he attends is a speech told by William Lloyd Garrison, 1841. As the story goes, William Lloyd Garrison sees Frederick Douglass sitting there in the crowd, and he asks Frederick Douglass, are you a runaway slave? And Frederick Douglass says yes, and so he's asked to stand up on the stage and basically tell his story. And at that point, Frederick Douglass, who apparently had this very deep, resonating voice, was a fantastic orator, kind of mesmerizes the crowd with his speech. So William Lloyd Garrison hires him, and he becomes part of the payroll to start giving lectures. So this is what he does. Now he ends up having a fallout with William Lloyd Garrison because Garrison becomes way too just crazy. I have in one of the slides where William Lloyd Garrison burns a copy of the Constitution and says that it was something like a deal with the devil or a covenant with hell or something like that. And Frederick Douglass just wants his fellow slaves to be freed. He doesn't want to deal with all this, bombastic constitutional or religious arguments. He wants freedom for his people. And so that's the big rift that they have. He even goes like Rosa Parks style, I have here, 1840s. Not only is he going against slavery, he's already jumping ahead 120, 130 years for segregation laws, right? He's protesting against whites-only railroad cars. And he just doesn't involve himself in racial affairs, but he's protesting against religious discrimination as well, which is kind of ironic, because remember, the Second Great Awakening is what really spawns the abolitionist movement, and here he is, again, attacking the segregation of different churches here. So what does he do himself? He actually founds his own paper. So if we have the Liberator, which was started by William Lloyd Garrison, you have Frederick Douglass, who founds a newspaper called the North Star, which has a lot of meaning, right? Because in the Underground Railroad, you always knew to keep going north if you followed the North Star. So it's kind of a cool name for his newspaper. 1850s, he's attacking job discrimination, school segregation, Martin Luther King style. and his house actually becomes a station on the Underground Railroad. And I'm going to talk a lot about the Underground Railroad a few lectures from now, so stay tuned. During the war, he recruits free African Americans to fight for the Union Army during the Civil War. In fact, 2, maybe 3 of his kids actually fight for the North. During the war, he's meeting with Abraham Lincoln on a regular basis to try and get the message out, to recruit more soldiers, especially African Americans, to fight for the North. He actually becomes, look, I don't know if he's the first. If he's not the first, he has to be pretty damn close to the first African American federal appointed official. He becomes the District of Columbia Recorder of Deeds from 1881 to 1886. He actually becomes an ambassador to Haiti, right? So he's an ambassador from 1889 to 1891, and he dies in 1895, just of old age. This is a picture taken, in the last few years of his life. So what a story, right? From a slave at the absolute lowest of the ladder to a runaway to the literate and all this other stuff. He becomes an ambassador he represents the U.S. government to that country in the 1880s. That's an amazing story. Some of his quotes that I like, and this is some of the speeches that he gave, and my favorite one is this very first one, and it kind of shows the ridiculousness of the institution of slavery. Remember, he's a runaway slave, so here's what he means by this quote. I appear before the immense assembly this evening as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master and ran off with them. So he's essentially, he's admitting, right, that he's guilty of theft. And what did he steal? He stole himself. And then he's got, ones that you see oftentimes in school hallways and stuff. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. When men sow the wind, it is rational to expect that they will reap the whirlwind. And again, there's a cool one where he talked about that, when he was a slave but literate, he would pray for freedom. And he prayed for freedom for 20 years, but God didn't answer him. And so then he prayed with his legs, and he became free. A spin on God helps those who help themselves. Okay, so another abolitionist was this lady here, Sojourner Truth. She's a freed African American. She's a female, and not only is she an abolitionist, but she's also a feminist. Unfortunately for her, she's also not a looker, right? I mean, that is not a pretty woman. She reminds me an awful lot of the Crypt Keeper from HBO fame from the 1980s. The South lashes back. So I have here 2 pictures from your book, and it discusses what the Southern argument in favor of slavery was, and I've talked a little about this before and a little bit in class. And here's the gist of their argument. Here on the left is a picture of what plantation life is like according to whites in the South. Right here you have a very happy white family here with 2 kids, the dog, right? There's even a white picket fence here in the background. And what are their slaves doing? Are they hurt? Are they sad? Are they abused? Are they murdered? No, they're happy. They're singing, they're dancing. It looks like fun to be a slave in this picture. And if you're old, right, and you can't work anymore, you're cared for like a kind old relative. And if you're a young baby, right, you're also cared for and you're given nice clothes. I mean, this guy's about the best dressed person here in this entire picture, right? Slavery's great. And what's going on in the North? Well, according to the South, here's what happens. Mothers die in childbirth. Here's the rich fat cat factory owner laughing at the misery of these white factory workers who are all disheveled, no food, no fire in the fireplace, right? They don't even have a bed, right? It's a pile of straw. And here's this woman here, who knows what she is. She's probably a whore. And here in the background is the stinky factory filled with pollution and other stuff, right? So here is life for the Southern factory worker. Here's life for the happy slave in the South. That's the South's argument. My response to this would be that photo of that poor gentleman with all of the lashes on his back. My response would be Sally Hemings. and the other thousands of women who were raped and bred like livestock. My response would be, why are there so many runaways if life is so good? My response is, why do you have to pass all these laws prohibiting them from literacy, from being together at night, if you have something to hide? Right? If life is this, why is the reality very, very different? And I'm not saying life was great for the white factory worker in the North, but it's not the life of a slave. Why does the South have to sneak through the House of Representatives in 1836 something called the Gag Resolution, whereby any future anti-slavery appeals are tabled without debate, meaning they don't even get to be argued in Congress. They just are instantly hidden, gone away. Why is it that abolitionist propaganda is destroyed in the South? That they have to actually destroy this material? And why do the feds agree with them? Right? I mean, they talk about this in the Andrew Jackson documentary even, that the feds ordered Southern postmasters to destroy abolitionist material and then actually arrested federal postmasters who didn't. Here we got, this is just a kind of a cool table of slave owning countries that you've heard of, hopefully, unless you're a complete moron. And when they abolished slavery, and then some, fun facts about each country. And you can see in chronologically, our friends to the south, Mexico, they abolished slavery in 1829. It's essentially what starts the independence movement of Texas, which we already talked about. Great Britain gets in the game in 1833. The United States finally, in the aftermath, I guess I kind of ruined the ending of the Civil War for you there, but slavery ends in the United States in 1865. The biggest country, I think, of importance is 1888, Brazil, because you remember that first chart I showed you guys of the importation of slaves from Africa, that millions of them are sent to Brazil. So slavery in Brazil continues for another entire generation after American slavery ends. And I didn't even know this before studying this course, but I mean, check this out. Slavery isn't abolished in China until 1949, and then 15 years before I was born, slavery apparently was still legal in parts of the Middle East. Here's just our final chronology slide. We're finally done with, I think I just broke the record for the longest lecture I've ever had, over an hour. I hope you've popped a few Gatorades and enjoyed it with me. We got the Cotton Gin, 1793. We got the American Colonization Society, formed 1817. Missouri Compromise, 1820. We got the Vesey Slave Rebellion, not Vesey, 1822. The establishment of Liberia, same year. We got the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion, 1831. We've got the Gag Resolution, passed 1836. We got Frederick Douglass publishes his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, in 1845. And the Free Soil Party, which I didn't talk about. It's a single-issue party that says that all new territory should be free of slaves, slave-free. So all that stuff from Louisiana Purchase and stuff that we get from the Mexican-American War, which we talk about the next chapter, all that Oregon territory, that should all be free, no matter where it falls on the old Missouri Compromise line. And that is it. An hour and 3 minutes.